Smoke lay on the sea when the last free winds of Valyria sighed across the world, and in that smoke a family of dragon lords watched the light of their old empire dim. They heard the stone groan far beneath their feet, the low strain of mountains making new shapes in the dark, and they understood, as sailors do before a storm, that something vast was turning. The Targaryens were not the greatest of Valyria's many proud houses. Not then, not when the towers were still pale as pearl and the roads glimmered like glass, but they had one treasure dearer than rubies, dearer than swords folded 100-fold. They had a dreamer. Daenerys was her name, the quiet daughter who listened to the hush between words and read the worlds tremble the way a harpist reads a string. In the nights before the doom, she described fire that fell like rain and seas that boiled and cities that breathed once, twice, and no more. She told her father, and he believed her. In this simple act of belief began the long strand of their rise and their ruin. They crossed the smoking waves to a jag of rock called Dragonstone, where the cliffs were black glass and the castle clung like a barnacle to the spine of an ancient volcano. Here the wind tasted of salt and sulfur, and gulls wheeled, arrogant and tireless. Beneath the castle, in caverns ribbed like the insides of a behemoth, their dragons slept, coiled and dreaming, the heat of them making the stones sweat. Valyrian, vast as a hill with wings like nights without moon. Vagor, whose eyes opened slow and patient. Mare axes, gleaming like a blade still wet from the quench. They had left the crowded splendors of Valyria for this lonely place, and Dragonstone took them into itself. Its damp breath, its stubborn silence, the earth's old heartbeat. When the doom came and the freehold screamed, when the fire jumped from mountain to mountain and the map of the world shook like a cloth, the Targaryens watched the horizon redden and knew the dream had been true. Years grew around them like ivy. Children were born and raised among winds that smelled of ash after rain. Coal glowed in braziers through winters, and the dragons learned the moods of the sea. In time, a young man stood on the battlements with his sisters and looked west. He was not overly tall, not unkindly, and the scars he carried were mostly the invisible sort. His name was Aegon, and he had the slow, inward gaze of a man who listens for meaning in the ordinary clatter of life. Some whispered that he, too, dreamed. He spoke little of it, only that the lands across the sea were many and were restless, that they shattered against one another like ice floes, and that from such breaking came miseries for little folk and wars for lords who knew no measure. To his left stood Visenya, stern as the blade she wore. To his right, Rhaenys, whose eyes found music everywhere. Between them, a choice shaped itself like a bird's shadow crossing a field. They launched not with trumpets but with a practical grace. Shipwrights hammered. The dragons stretched their wings and rustled like sails. When they crossed, the water swelled blue and green, and the air peeled away their old life as a tide peels the sand. At the mouth of a river that widened into promise, they raised a fort of timber and hope. The wood smelled of sap and raw beginnings. They staked a banner where the wind could worry it. 3 heads on red, black wings flung to either side, and for a moment the river seemed to listen. Then the 7 kingdoms began to stir. Power is always a weather, and in those days it came in gusts from every quarter. The castles of the Reach flourished amid golden fields, and the lions of the west peered from their red hills with eyes like coin. To the north, forests marched to the sky, and stone kept its oaths even when men did not. In the riverlands, waters braided different loyalties together and then back apart, while in the stormlands an old anger drummed in every cloud. Snakes coiled in Dornish sands, bright-eyed and unblinking. Everywhere, boundaries bristled. Everywhere, titles clanged. Everywhere, men believed the world was exactly as large as their maps. Aegon understood maps differently. His were made not only of land but of longing, not only of roads but of rumor and fear. He went first to those who could be turned by a word rather than a war. He bent his ear to lords who understood that a dragon's breath could melt the argument out of even the most stubborn keep. And when the proud would not bend, fire taught them. At Harrenhal, where the name was a fortress unto itself and stone rose like a dare to any sky, men scoffed at shadows passing overhead. The walls there had been poured in grief and ambition. They had eaten lives and coin and time. In the morning the stone was hard as fate. By evening it was running, and the air tasted of iron and despair, and the mighty house that had boasted it would endure outlasted even its own breath, outlasted it by no more than an hour. Fields became theaters. At the field of fire, the grain was full and gold, a beautiful, careless wealth, and into it came armies with banners as if they meant to harvest. Steel flashed.
Komm ans ran.
And then the dragons crossed the sun, and the day became a furnace where the ground itself simmered. Men knelt not to Aegon but to the limits of their own bodies, to thirst, to heat, to the knowledge that some powers do not negotiate. One king in the north bent the knee without battle at all. Torrhen Stark looked into the future as a steward looks into a winter pantry and did his counting, not of pride but of lives. When he knelt, the snow did not scorn him. It fell silently, approving of such wisdom, and the north lived. Not all lands could be taken by flame. Dorne flowed away from fire like silk. It hid in canyons and smiled behind veils, and when Rhaenys swept low on mare axes, she felt the ground resist her not with spears but with patience. A bolt found the dragon's eye. Some say by skill, some say by luck, and the world turned. Mare axes fell like a star, and dust rose in a grief that did not make a sound at first. Rhaenys was gone into that dust or into the fierce quiet that follows catastrophe, and for a long time Aegon spoke her name only while watching the sea. Eventually a treaty came, but not before rage had burned its way to ember. New kings are shaped by what they lose, as much as what they win. He ruled from a city that was not yet a city. The mud around the fort clung to boots and to plans. The red keep rose slow, brick by patient brick, and the scent of mortar and wet rope and horses became the perfume of a capital that had no memory yet of being great. Aegon crowned himself in the sight of the Seven and the laws of his own making, and a small council gathered at his table like weather vanes around a storm. There were roads to be mended and coin to be trusted and grievances to hear until they transformed into quiet. Through it all, Balerian's shadow passed the sun now and then, reminding lords that the crown was not merely a man in a chair but a promise bound to heat and sky. Kingship is a bridge between worlds, and bridges sway. After Aegon, his son Aenys listened too softly to the creak of planks, smiling at courtiers and hoping that kindness would teach men to hold their weight well. But the faith took offense at old Valyrian ways that survived like a burr in the Targaryen robe. Hearts were set alight in the name of gods as readily as fields had been set in the name of kings, and the realm learned that peace can sometimes be a candle. A draft will find it. When Maegor came, the draft found iron. He ruled as a clenched fist, and in the shadow of his will, fear grew like mold in sealed rooms. He was relentless, efficient, and blind to the truth that a crown without love is a millstone. The stones of the city remembered him with a flinch long after he was gone. From that harshness, a softening arrived like evening cool after a day of too much sun. Jaehaerys, called the Conciliator, and Alysanne, whose kindness was a road in itself, found the realm weary enough to be taught. They stitched torn cloth with new laws. They rode the length of the land and sat in chilly keeps with gloves off to hear what the air said about hunger and tax and the cruelty of certain small men in large capes. Their dragons touched down in villages that had never expected such company, and children reached to touch warm scales and were not scolded. Under Jaehaerys, bridges were built not only of oak and rope but of trust. The faith was soothed, and the old wounds stopped weeping. For a while, the realm was a table set and a hearth well tended. But time is an untiring mason. Under his trowel, even the most careful stonework shifts. The Conciliator grew old. His hands, once steady on the reins, trembled. Succession raised its familiar, insistent question, and lords became lawyers of their own bloodlines. At a great council they chose Viserys, a man fond of ease and story and the glow of a fire on winter evenings. He had within him the temper of a host, the belief that everyone will leave satisfied if only the conversation stays gentle. He named his daughter Rhaenyra his heir, and for years the world walked along that idea as if along a garden path. Then again came that quick little knife named marriage. Viserys took Alicent to wife, she who understood the art of stillness, and the path split into two without anyone raising a lantern over the fork. The dragons felt the change before the men did. They stamped and hissed, and the dragon keepers grew wary. In the Red Keep, laughter became a brittle thing. When Viserys died, grief tore its usual holes in the fabric of life, and into those holes slipped rumors, ambitions, and the certainty each heart holds that the story must end with itself in light. Rhaenyra's claim and Aegon's claim, Alicent's son, stood facing each other like two great stones in a river, splitting the flow, creating eddies that swirled and pulled. Lords pledged and repented and pledged again. The realm looked up and saw dragons not as the safe, rare fireside tales of childhood, but as the old gods of weather, as mercies and punishments hurtling on the wing. They called it a dance, which was a way of pretending order where there was none. There is no choreography in the lilt of a mourning mother's voice, no graceful step in the fall of a boy from a saddle high above a storming sea. Princes dueled in the sky where wind tears sound to tatters. Castles changed hands overnight to the rasp of gritted teeth. In the streets, gossip flowered and withered on the same breath, and bread grew dear. The dance scoured the realm as a fire scours a hillside, leaving stones raw and the shape of the land visible, a hard truth. At storm's end, a child on a dragon met his uncle on a larger one. Thunder muttered like old men. Somewhere above the boiling surf, fear and pride and the sudden realization of how small a body is inside a life flashed through a boy like lightning, and then the sea reclaimed its own. Elsewhere, a queen who had waited too long was fed to a dragon, and the people watched as if watching their own hope melt. Streets crowded with eyes can be crueler than any throne room. When the flurry settled, it left a boy king sitting too solemn for his years. Aegon III, the Dragonbane, had eyes that had learned to look away, and from his reign the great beasts dwindled. It was as if the dance had burned something out of the world that no law could replace. Eggs grew still, wings grew thin. The last dragon came small and sickly into a reign that did not seem impressed. Men told stories and pretended that the telling would keep the fire alive. In Dragonstone's caverns the old heat faded to memory. The realm went on with mills turning and grain grinding and coin clinking. But those who had seen the sky afire carried a dim ache at the base of the skull that no physician see. Old Cure, the line of Targaryen kings wound onward, narrowing and widening like a river trapped by its own banks. Viserys II brought order as a craftsman brings varnish, making a rough table gleam and last. Then came Aegon IV, called Unworthy, whose desires fell out of him like nuts from a torn sack, spilling consequences down every stair. He made bastards as carelessly as he made promises, then gathered up those bastards into legitimacy at his death like a child sweeping game pieces into the wrong box. Swords were given to the wrong hands. In halls across the realm, men looked at old friends and saw new enemies fostered in their own hearts. From this sowing rose harvests of rebellion with patient names. The Blackfire Wars were not a single storm but a season of them, each one finding the ground already wet. Daemon, who took the old king's sword as if taking the sun at noon, gathered men to him by the warmth of that gesture, and the realm split again, not with the roar of dragons now but with the clear, colder clang of steel on steel. Fields in the Reach lay trampled once more, river crossings turned to churned, red mud, and mothers taught their children to nap through the sound of drums. The Golden Company that took shape across the narrow sea carried with it a memory of home as tender and as dangerous as fire wrapped in cloth. Battles were decided by the stubbornness of a few and the footwork of rain. The rebellions rose and fell like fever until, at last, they cooled, leaving scars that weather would find many winters later. Between these wars, goodness appeared like clear days. Daeron the Good brought Dorne into the fold not with flame but with a wedding feast. And there was intelligence in that, and an elegance too, one that made the maps blush to see themselves redrawn without smoke. But the realm remembered how to shake. There were pirates to punish, and princes to measure, and whispers to catch in doorways while pretending not to have heard them. At Stepstones, men fought the Ninepenny Kings, a gallows humor name for a group whose ambitions were far from cheap. When Maelys fell and his line with him, It seemed for a breath that the world would accept its new equilibrium. That breath was not long. Ares II came like a candle too close to a curtain. He was a man whose fear bit him with his own teeth. In his youth he shone because the realm wanted him to. In his age he burned because he no longer knew how to stop. He had married Riella in a union meant to bind the line tightly to itself, and at first they were as handsome as a storybook. But fear has a way of pacing, of wearing grooves in stone, of finding the narrowest places in the mind and turning them into traps. His friend in hand, Tywin, built prosperity as a mason builds an arch. Calculating, impersonal, precise, and the city grew sleek. Tourneys glittered. In such light, a prince named Rhaegar read in the dust motes and listened to the music the air makes when it is very still. He was pale as a late apricot and carried his silences like a harp. People loved him as they love a song that feels like winter and spring at once. At a great tourney in the shadow of Black Harrenhal, where even laughter learns to echo, the realm leaned forward as if to catch a rumor falling. The prince crowned a wolf made with a flower, and the petals reflected in 100 hungry eyes. Whisperers sang of love and of duty wrestling like brothers. In the north, a proud house bristled. In the Stormlands, a fostered boy named Robert clenched anew, righteous anger in his hands like a hammer he had always meant to lift. The match was struck, though no one noticed at first. Then fire woke and ran across the hay. What followed was a rebellion with the sound of hoofbeats like a heart failing and recovering and failing again. Banners spread like stains across hills. Ravens flew until the air was dark with messages. Ares, beaten by paranoia and courted by cruel men who fed it, demanded sacrifices to a coward god that lived only in his head. Fathers and sons were broken in his halls. When the city was finally sacked, it was not the cleansing rain some had imagined, but a grim, inevitable thaw. A prince fell at a river crossing bright with spears, and for a moment the water itself seemed to hold its breath as if in respect. The king died not on a battlefield but on the edge of the room that had once been his world, and the throne he had loved, all harsh iron and shadows, looked on with a face that never changes. The blood of the dragons did not end there. Across the narrow sea, in cities where the light comes through colored glass and the heat sleeps in courtyards, 2 children were led from house to house like refugees from a story that no longer wanted them. Viserys was thin and hot with memories he repeated until they frayed. His sister was a girl made of tidewater and patience, a girl with a name like a bell. Daenerys learned to keep close to breezes and to want little. Sometimes, when the world quieted just so, she thought she could hear another heartbeat layered over her own. The old beasts far away under new stars. She married for safety into a tented world where the sky was the palace and the earth was the hall. The man she wed was a storm contained in flesh. He smelled of leather and dust and horse, and when he laughed it sounded like the hoofbeats of 100 riders cresting a hill. In that life, she learned another kind of power, one braided from the hair of loyalty and the simple arithmetic of food and water and shade. Then illness came as it often does, unsummoned, unreasonable, and the tented palace became a place of sighs. At a pyre beneath a sky hungering for a new story, Daenerys stepped into loss and came out with 3 small answers curled against her heart. Dragons hatched where the world had decided they were done. They came thin as promises at first, then stronger, then confident enough to rattle the bars of the old cage called history. She crossed deserts like a woman walking across a prayer. In the cities of slavers she offered a choice, liberation spoken aloud in the common tongue, and learned that freedom is not a spell but a set of doors that must each be opened, sometimes twice, sometimes with shaking hands. She took cities the way a river takes a bend, grinding down stones, leaving silt and sweetness for those behind. People cried her name in streets that had never said it before. The dragons grew, and when they tasted the wind of their birthright, the world changed color a little. Ruling is slower than conquering. It is all dusk and bookkeeping. In palaces painted the color of ripe fruit, Daenerys tried sitting still long enough to be a queen. She learned the weight of petitions, the thickness of law, the surprising sharpness of the pause before saying yes. Enemies came dressed as friends, and friends became dangers because they could not dream as large as she needed them to. The dragons, impatient with the geometry of streets, scorched what should not be scorched. A compromise struck today, frayed by tomorrow, became a snare. And yet her name continued to spread like heat from a coal raked into fresh air. There are always counselors. Some come with histories too long to be told before supper. Others come with eyes like clear water and a talent for surviving. The dwarf with quick tongue and slower loyalties joined her, bringing with him the battered elegance of a mind that had learned to reckon with ridicule. The faithful knight, stained by disgrace, bent the knee again to what he had found in himself as much as in her. Unsullied marched, 1,000 quiet heartbeats on the move. Dothraki thunder returned to the sea they had never wished to cross. Wings cast shadows on deck planks where no ship had ever thought to shade the sun. At last she turned her gaze west and saw not merely a crown but the debt ledger of a world that had laughed while others bled. The crossing was the culmination of every staircase she had climbed barefoot. Westeros rose from the horizon, gray and green and stubborn as ever. Armies met. Castles learned again the tremor that runs along their stones when dragons pass overhead. It seemed, for a season, that the old house would be restored to its old chair, with a new posture and a different breath. But thrones are not furniture. They are illnesses one can catch. Meanwhile, the North learned a secret kept too neatly under winter. A boy who had built his life on the humility of being unimportant discovered the opposite, and the knowledge fit him in the way armor fits a man who expected to die a squire. Awkward, heavy, inevitable. Rhaegar's blood lay curled in him like a sleeping child, and the world's intentions toward him shifted accordingly. He had his father's melancholy and his mother's hush and a love for the frost that made him honest. He walked the snow as if it were a library, and though he had no wish to be king of any chair, the world does not ask such men for their wishes. When the dead rose, when winter's most literal metaphor clothed itself in ice and merciless intent, the dragons were not a symbol but a tool as essential as a torch in a cave. Air burned over fields that had been quiet since harvest. The light of a dragon's breath made night retreat for a heartbeat at a time, and in those heartbeats men and women measured their courage. The great danger passed like a fever after sweat, and the world thought of embracing itself in relief. But the old chairs waited, patient as stones. King's Landing had grown into itself. The Red Keep loomed with the kind of self-confidence only a building acquires, the suspicion that it is more real than any human who passes through it. Bells, that strange conscience of cities, hung silent until they did not. When they rang, people looked up with hope as if they had heard that rain was coming. Then the sky opened not with rain but with fire. The dragon descended street by street, and the narrow alleys learned a thorough lesson in endings. There is a point in every calamity when the body understands before the mind does. In that city, in that hour, people began to run without knowing why, and then they knew. The queen on the dragon had borne too long the laughter of men who had minimized her, had set too much of herself in the idea of breaking a wheel to see the smallness of the spokes she was cracking underfoot. Fire writes very plainly. When she had finished writing, ash fell, soft and treacherous, trying to make the ruin seem serene. In a chamber emptied by conscience, the man who loved her's love became a kind of mercy that hurt even as it healed a future. He did what lovers sometimes do in the oldest stories. He folded his heart around a knife. Her dragon, that great grief with wings, took her away in an arc that made the city hold its breath once more. The smell of char lingered for seasons. The throne, that jagged silhouette cut from old boast and old blade, melted into a reminder of how longing can devour the object it wants most. The city wept without noise. People swept. Markets reopened. Children asked their mothers why the sky still looked scorched. What remains after a fall is a question the world never tires of asking. For the Targaryens, it was a silence full of ghosts. A boy who was also a man, who was also a name too heavy for his mouth, walked into a northern exile and found in it a truth his blood had always known, that some kingship is best expressed by standing aside while others warm themselves at the common fire. Far to the east, in halls that had once murmured in lyrical tongues, there were still tapestries with dragons stitched faint and fine as veins in a leaf. The blood did not end with a single breath. Blood never does. Thins, it thickens, it goes on. In small villages, children born with silver hair found themselves the subject of superstitions that tasted of the sea. In ships' holds, smuggle. Aras carried carved dragon eggs as curiosities. Somewhere, on some bluff with a view of the world's blue curve, an old woman told a child a story about 3 heads and a banner flapping like a heartbeat. Rise is not an elevator humming serenely to the top, but a footpath winding up and around a mountain that is also a mood. The Targaryens rose step by step, slipping sometimes, catching themselves with hands burned on a rope they insisted on holding. So too with their fall. It did not come in a single plunge but in slides, in the crumble of edges, in choices made by men and women under weather too strong for them. Dragons were an argument the world could not often counter. Yet in the end, it was not a dragon that decided the last shape of the house but the familiar human litany. Pride, fear, love, prophecy, hunger. The old dream of Dini's had begun their book. Other dreams, misunderstood or carried too far, turned pages faster than any scribe, until the last spread showed not a glorious ending but a void filled with the steady warmth of ordinary lives continuing. On Dragonstone, the caverns lie where they have always lain. If a traveler lights a torch and goes down, she will feel the heat stored in the basalt like an old secret. She will hear water ticking somewhere deeper, counting centuries. She may believe she sees, just past the glow, a curve of horn, a gleam of old scale. But that is the mind honoring its elders. Outside, the sea keeps its patient work, biting a little more with every tide. Gulls cry, petulant and unphilosophical. The wind runs its ghostly fingers through the grass. And when dusk leans close, when the sun's last note is a red thread on the horizon, one can almost hear wings overhead, as if the air, remembering, rehearses again the sound it made when the sky belonged to fire. The rise teaches that vision matters, that a handful of people on a wave-bitten rock can reroute history if they listen to the tremor under their own feet. The fall teaches that warmth can become heat, can become flame that does not know a face. Between these lessons lies a long, human story of meals shared and oaths sworn and hands held, of maps drawn and torn, of bells taken down and rehung. The Targaryens brought the language of dragons to a land of iron, then misread their own translation. Yet the land itself is not unkind. Spring follows ash with ferocious gentleness. Wildflowers find cracks and insist on color. Children play king on stairwells whose stone once knew bootsteps of men with very real crowns, and their laughter is the best kind of treason. In the north, snow falls softly, and the trees shoulder it with patience. South in the capital, the harbor swings its doors open to ships whose cargo is neither destiny nor doom but oranges. Wool, a troupe of actors, a monkfish the size of a child. On a quiet morning, a woman buying eels peers up at the shattered skyline and decides, without drama, to be kind to the next person she meets. In the reach, under pergolas humming with bees, an old knight tells a boy groom how he once saw a dragon and how it smelled like rain before it arrives. And the boy believes him because it is a beautiful thing to believe. Far away across the sea, a merchant fingers a brooch shaped like a 3-headed serpent and feels something stir that is not entirely greed. So the tale goes to Ember. It is not a quarrel with finality to say it warms rather than burns. The Targaryens, with their impossible pets and their terrible gifts, wrote themselves on wind and water and stone until there was no more room for ink. The rest is the world remembering how to be itself. At night, by a crackling fire, when the doors are barred against ordinary drafts, someone will always tell it. They will begin with smoke because smoke is what everything becomes in time, and they will speak slowly because unspooling a life requires care. They will say that a dream saved a family and sent them west, and that the family learned to speak in the language of flame, and that the flame, as it must, spoke back, politely at first and then not at all. They will finish with quiet, as all good histories do, and with the sense that something immense has passed like a ship beyond the headland, leaving only a long, rocking swell and a horizon that permits anyone willing to look to imagine what might still come sailing out of it. In the seasons after the bells and ash, the city learned how to breathe again, the way a body relearns the rhythm of sleep after a long illness. Stones blackened by heat grew pale with rain, then bleached with sun until the scars became new skin. Masons rose before dawn to climb scaffold that creaked like old ships, and up there, where gulls passed on their errands and roofs made a chessboard of clay and slate, they set brick on brick and remembered, without saying it aloud, the color of the sky the day the dragon wrote its last sentence across the city. Children followed the carts of sand and lime as if they were grand processions. They scooped up what sifted off and made little kingdoms at the edges of fountains, each with its own mud-walled keep and moat filled from a cupped hand. By the time the bells tolled for evensong, these kingdoms had washed away, leaving small wet rings like the halos of vanished moons. The city accepted the lesson with the quiet dignity of a place that has learned humiliation is not the same as ending. Down by the quays, tar and salt made a tough perfume, and ropes sang as sailors hauled them over bollards rubbed smooth by decades of pull. Flocks of pigeons took their daily counsel atop the bronze of mermaids and kings. Fishwives compared prices with an indifference that would have offended the gods if they still took offense. The towers of the Red Keep sat like old knees above it all, less a threat now than a set of large bones in which the weather lodged. Men with ledgers came and went under the gate, counting grain, counting fish, county. In days since the great burning with a private arithmetic that involved wives and children and debts they were too proud to call by their names. In a pepper-scented room far from the harbor spray, a man with a chain around his throat and ink under every nail wrote as the daylight fell into honey and then into iron. His window looked west. Evenings set gold coins on the water to lure the eyes of men who still believed in treasure. The maester's quill scratched steadily, a small, civilized sound, like a cricket in a library. He had begun with a simple intention, to gather into one place the scattered lives of a house that had ridden weather like a giant bird. But intentions are ladders that do not show their height until you climb. He found that to right of them was to climb toward heat and toward night, to places where the words curled of their own accord, as if startled by something they had not meant to see. He recorded the early voices first, those that came as clearly as wine through an open door. Deanie's whispering of burning mountains, Aegon in a hall of timber looking up at rafters that still smelled of sap, Rhaenys laughing the way a stream laughs in a dry year. He paused over the king's peace and over the king who made it, lingered at councils where patience was poured like wine, followed riders as they crossed bridges that had not existed the day before. When he came to the dance, he set down his quill and sat with his hands linked before his mouth, head bowed as if in prayer. He had heard all the versions in all the kitchens, in all the seps, in all the rooms where grief goes to be less alone. A green ribbon tied around a black handle, a prince's eye on the wrong horizon, an old habit of listening to prophecy as if it were a map. He wrote carefully, like a man walking a ridge at dusk. Then he turned the page to the time of drought in the stables of the sky, when horses outnumbered dragons and men tried to do the work of wings with courage alone. The Blackfire Wars became pages of dust, and sudden flowers of blood bloomed there and faded just as swiftly. Between them, he discovered small intricacies that never make songs. A widow who forgave the man who burned her orchard. The brother who dug a grave for a stranger with the patient seriousness of repair. A girl whose only heirloom was a silver button lost in straw during a hurried escape and miraculously found years later by the child she had taught to make the bed. He wondered if such fragments, set carefully end to end, might walk themselves across the charcoal stretch of great events. But the ink insisted on fire again. He came to the storm-born prince who liked to listen to music before decisions, to the tourney where flowers turned to flint, to the rebellion that pounded along the roads like a boot on a hollow stair. He wrote of the queen in the tents beneath a sky as broad as the steppes and of 3 small lives uncoiling from ash like ferns from forest floor. He traced her across deserts that paid with mirage for every drop of water, into cities where chains made a bright ring around men's throats and the price of freedom had never been tallied in any serious ledger. He described how dragons returned to the vocabulary of the world and how that vocabulary both freed and betrayed the mouth that used it. When he reached the bells and the flame, his lamp had almost gone out. He felt the wick pinch between his fingers and smelled singeing skin before he realized he had lifted the light too close to read. He leaned back then and listened to the slow summer thunder of carts trundling across the cobbles below. Their rhythm brought him to another thunder, older and stranger. The applause of a crowd for an event no sane person could applaud. Summer Hall. The very name tasted of contradiction in the mouth. A cup of milk set down in a room where a lantern had just fallen into oil. He had no love for rumor. The chain at his throat was as good as a promise. But rumor and truth had been married that day in a ceremony no one would ever fully describe. He set down what he could. A fortress built to honor a season. A king who thought fire could be persuaded into loyalty. A rain that came too late. A child's first breath drawn in a room that had just finished failing an older generation. He wrote the scent of wet cinders, the glare that leaves a man's face forever filmed. The sudden stillness of musicians whose instruments warped in heat like honest hearts under pressure. And then he let the page rest, the ink drying into a pattern like a flock of departing swallows. Outside the maester's window, the city failed at forgetting and succeeded at living. The shoemaker's son whistled the melody he had heard from his sister's spinning wheel, and the tune drifted out past the alley and went up into the air and gave a falcon someplace to fall into. A beggar who had lost the habit of asking for what would not be given found a small coin in the seam between two stones and laughed without bitterness. On a balcony, an old woman who had outlived more kings than she cared to count set a bowl of pomegranates on the ledge and watched the light find every scatter of scarlet in every glossy seed. She had seen dragons. She had seen the way power eats intention and brings its plate back to the kitchen as if sure more will be provided. Now she liked to notice when the street dogs slept with their paws twitching, as if they dreamed of running and were content to stay where they were. In the riverlands, floodplains still discovered their own boundaries every spring. The water came brown and hungry at first, then glassy, then full of reflected starlight as it sprawled and settled and began to whisper to reeds and carp. A man who had sharpened swords for 3 separate banners was making plowshares under a shed of thatch, the smoke of the forge torn into strips by a crosswind. He had been paid once in coin and once in a promise and once in the feeling of a hand. Against his forehead right before a battle, a hand that smelled of leather and talc and was gone forever by noon. When he hammered iron that had melted from a throne he would never sit on, he felt something large and entirely untheological lift from his chest. The blade of his new plow took an edge with the ease of a clear apology. In the first field he turned, birds came behind him as if to bless what he did not name. On the island where dragons had liked to sleep, the wind told its same old stories with a sincerity that never grew tiresome. Dragonstone's cliffs were dark and sure. They fitted the waves as the teeth fit a jaw. In the caverns where fire had once lounged, the rocks still sweated a little after a week of rain. Candles placed there would flicker as if considering speeches they might make and then think better of it. The dragon keepers were long gone, but the walls remembered their songs. A fisherwoman, cutting a new path across a nest of brambles near the amphitheater of stone, put her hand on what she thought was a black, smooth rock. It looked like an ember frozen in the act of remembering. She carried it home the way one carries a found shell, half amusement and half the feeling of having been singled out. In winter she set it under the bed to cup warmth. In summer she propped the door with it and said it was the only noble in her house who still served. That stone passed, years later, into the hands of a trader clever in the mathematics of wonder. He sold the idea of what might be tucked under a man's traveling cloak as readily as he sold salt and saffron. When he unwrapped the black thing at a table in Pentos, far from the gulls and far from the patient green slope of Dragonstone, the men gathered felt their eyes warm under their lids, as if they had been peeling onions. The trader talked of eggs and of lineages and of fires that know their masters. A magister whose love of beauty had outlived his love of truth touched the rock and felt nothing, which only made him more determined to coax sense from it. He put it on a shelf between a brass astrolabe that only told the hour correctly when it rained and a jar of glass beads that changed color with the moods of the hands that touched them. He told a girl he liked that he owned a moon. She laughed, then later in the dark felt the rock with her foot when she went to pour water and dreamed the whole night of wings. Sailors who do not trust maps written by men who cannot tie a clove hitch watched for certain colors in certain swells as they rounded the black islet where a keep squatted like a memory of an older, sharper age. At night, the sea murmured in a language anyone who had been loved understood, and sometimes someone, thinking of a child or a woman or a lost dog, would look up expecting to see the old silhouette against the moon. When none appeared, they told themselves tales they could believe. The dragons, they said, had gone to a warmer climate where the air respected them, or they had been made too sad by the idea of a city's bells and had chosen a solitude the way old kings choose silence. Or else, and this was told with the satisfaction men take in plausible endings, the dragons had become what they had always been, a word for a power not meant to last on the tongues of people. Across the straits, where markets never sleep and narrow water sees more ambition than any court ever will, an old sellsword held court of his own beneath a canopy patched with flags from a dozen lost lords. His face had been carved by sun and by the particular intensity of staring through sandstorms. He told the Blackfire story the way sailors tell weather, proud of their memory and careful with the names of winds. He tapped the table when he came to the first taking of the sword, then again when he reached the betrayal, and once more with thumb instead of knuckle when he said the word company as if it were a wife who wrote every night. The younger men leaned in, one hand shading their beer from the flies, and asked whether the old banner still hung anywhere a man might see it. "Aye," said the sellsword. "In every tavern where the bill is paid and in every kit where a man keeps his last clean shirt, is hung in the mind. That's a harder wall to take. Dorn ripened under its habitual sun, where even the shadows have educated opinions. In the water gardens, the splash and patter of children's play made a music that never needed a bard, and the palms lifted their fronds and put them down again as if conducting. On evenings when the air felt like a hand a mother would lay on a fevered brow, an old woman with a jaw as fine as a scimitar sat with a fan in her lap and told a boy with knees like brown apples how a dragon had once fallen in their sands. She told him what patience had accomplished and what the spear had merely postponed. She told him that a treaty is a promise two liars make to outwit a winter they do not believe belongs to them. "Remember," she said, and the boy nodded in the automatic agreement of childhood. Yet her voice went on into the fountain's plash and was not wasted there. In the north, the snow continued its unlabeled work. It fell where it pleased and made beauty of what it did not bury. The trees stood with the tolerant posture of beings who have seen kings come and go and seen, too, the stern insufficiency of the crown against a long season. In crypts under stone and then under more stone, the air kept a different calendar. It knew the day Torin kneeled. It knew the day a soft-footed boy lit a candle with shaking hands and asked a statue to forgive him for what he had not yet done. It knew the hour a woman set a flower like a spill of wine at the feet of a king who had forgotten he was remembered. Winter was not a villain here. It was a teacher of precise lessons about boundaries and about the kindness of stored apples. The reach sang to itself in fields so fat the plow stalled unless coaxed. In that sweet earthland, old men who had bent their backs to harvest for 60 years sometimes straightened reflexively and looked toward the west as if to gauge whether the sun would have the decency to set gently. They spoke of the old field of fire with a tone that was almost wonder, not for the burning itself but for the cleanliness of its decision. "It made us neighbors," one said to another as they adjusted straw hats that had known more summers than most kings. "Afterward we had to live next to one another. That is where the work began. High in the vale, where the air is the pure blue of a bowl graven from ice, the remembered landing of a queen's shadow on a mountain meadow still made shepherds pull their cloaks tighter. It was not fear. It was respect for the scale of the world when it chooses to address itself to a man. An old ewe with a bell that had belonged to her grandmother dam led the flock by the edge of a cliff where sometimes, if a herdsman was unlucky enough to look up at the right moment, he saw his own life from above as if he were a bird and realized how narrow a shelf a man occupies between storm and sleep. The eyrie glittered in the distance like a solution to a problem that no one but a certain kind of lord would care to solve. And always there was the thing men did when they were through talking. They sat by fires and let the heat lick the backs of their hands, and they told the old story. It grew softer in the telling. The high points lowered their voices and the low points rose. The dragons' names changed like the names of saints do when they travel from land to land. Their shapes softened to fit the mouths that shaped them. Children fell asleep to the rhythm of wing and wind and a map made simpler to suit a night mind. Mothers and fathers learned how to leave out certain cruelties without cheating the truth, and how to use certain small, bright facts. A queen's laughter on a morning ride. A king's tender habit of moving his thumb when he was thinking hard, to illuminate larger darknesses. One evening at a crossroads in whose foundation stones had been repurposed from a ruin no one remembered the name of. A quiet singer with hair like old rope sat with a harp and played not battle hymns but the thin, persistent tunes of work. The song of a woman sweeping a shop before sunrise. The song of a boy hooking eels from a rain barrel. The song of a man who made the same prayer every day and did not notice that it was being answered in tiny installments. These were his verses, and the room changed its breathing to hear them. When he paused, an old knight with joints that complained the way old dogs complain when they rise said, almost to himself, that he had once seen the inside of the dragon pit before it fell. He described the lime dust like a blessing that never left your hair, the iron hoops that held the world together in the shape of a circle, the high, proud way the beasts had stood before they learned to fear ropes. He tasted the old air as he spoke, and when he fell silent the rafters held the memory for him, relieving him of the burden. To the east, where rivers divide empires as easily as a knife divides a loaf, men in scarlet talked before braziers about princes promised and songs that meant more than they said. Some kissed fire and came away healed of nothing but cured, for a time, of the desire to be someone else. A girl who had been told all her life she was ordinary held her hand above a flame and recited a prayer she had learned in a city of bells. And when the heat did not bite, she lifted her eyes and understood that there were as many kinds of miracle as there were kinds of hunger. Farther still, in Ass-High, where the night pretends to be deeper than it is, a man who sold maps cat-scratched with places no one will ever go told a wealthy fool that there were still dragons in valleys where the sky was too shy to appear at noon. He smiled because he was not lying. There were dragons there, all of them made by longing and all of them fed by coin. No one trusted Valyria, even in legend. Ships who came too close to its surviving teeth returned with barnacles like jewels and with men who had learned to say nothing for weeks at a time. Occasionally a captain's son came back with a small, jeweled bone in his pocket and fever in his eyes and spoke brokenly of statues that blinked as the tide moved. Of bridges so thin cows refused them, though men crossed fearlessly. Of a sound like a cathedral learning anew him. The fathers burned the trinkets and bathed the sons. And sometimes it worked, and sometimes the new quiet ate the boy whole and left a calm body to sail future voyages with a steadiness that no weather could trouble. On certain moonless nights, fishermen claimed they could hear a deep, slow exhale from that direction as if some colossus, condemned to sleep under the sea, were practicing acceptance. Back in King's Landing, where the smoke and steam of 1,000 kitchens was a kind of weather, a boy apprenticed to a mason learned the knack of smoothing a seam until it seemed as if two stones had forgiven one another. He liked to walk the old paths under the keep, places where the air remembered kings. There were skulls once, his master told him, staring over the room like unasked questions. There were fires one could feel even with the lamp unlit. If any remained, they were elsewhere now, perhaps as shrine, perhaps as lesson, perhaps as curiosity in private chambers. The boy did not long to see them. He had taught himself to love forms of grandeur that did not stare back. The long, perfect curve of a barrel vault. The way a line of brick could be made to run like a thought through a wall. The satisfaction of an arch that bore more weight than it asked to. He considered it an honest piety. A girl in the same city kept a small shop selling thread and light. She wore thimbles as if they were rings. She had been a child the day the dragon flew and remembered, with tea. The intensity of certain early memories, the way the heat wrote on her skin like a stern ant. Now she wound skeins for women older than her and nodded as they told the same story for the 10th time because the telling made their hands steady. At night she lit 3 candles, one for those gone, one for those present, one for those not yet here, and watched the flames consult one another. If the shop cats blinked in unison when the middle candle flickered, she whispered a joke to the air, and the room seemed to smile. Not far away, under a tiled roof that had survived 2 fires and a siege by pretending to be less important than it was, a cook kneaded bread and thought of dragons the way a man who has broken his ankle thinks of falling. Rarely, but with a respect that gladness cannot erase. He had seen a boy become a man in a day, seen a woman become a general in a quarter hour, seen an army turn its head to look at something that had no answer. He had also seen the way dough yields to insistence, the way heat persuades the reluctant flour to become sustenance, the way patience is rewarded more often than law. He had come to prefer these miracles and to serve them lavishly. The Sea Lords of Driftmark continued their long consideration of horizon and wind. Their halls smelled of rope, of salt, of that faint coppery tang cords leave on a man's hands when pulled hard and long. In the genealogy of hearsay they were cousins to dragons, and when a child in the house was born with hair so pale it seemed to comment on light itself, the grandmothers tooted and went about laying extra blankets near the cradle. For such children, they said, feel cold most keenly. On storm nights, when waves shook their hands like men needing to be convinced, the heads of the house stood on the windward gallery and thought of bargains struck generations back with the sky. They had kept their end. Boats mended, sailors paid, widows not forgotten. And if the wind chose to laugh, well, it laughed at everyone eventually. On a winter road north of the Neck, two brothers on shaggy ponies traveled between villages whose names were as plain as their bread. The younger, who had a gift for losing mittens, asked about dragons as one asks about summer during a squall. The elder, who had a gift for balance, thought a long while and then told a story of a day he had been set to guard a wood where nothing ever happened. He spoke of a shadow passing over the trees like a sermon. He spoke of the pine tips bowing as if greeted. He spoke of a heat that made the snow run in little stealthy streams to hide under roots. When his brother, thinking this is how stories are meant to end, asked what the dragon had done next, the elder smiled into the wind and said, "It went on. It had its business. That was enough." A septon who kept bees in a walled garden beside his modest temple, the walls mainly kept out the goats, found that the hum made his sermons better than any book. He preached of fire carefully. He did not say that it was wicked. He had warmed his hands too often to lie. He did not say that it was holy. He had seen it do too many things without asking permission. He said it was a fact, and that the gods, if they love truth, ought to love facts. When he spoke of the Targaryens, it was with the same voice he used to describe a late frost or a particularly generous harvest. They were, he told his small congregation, they were difficult and dazzling and wrong and right. They were as mortal as any of us, and as unlike us as a river is unlike the rain that feeds it. In Old Town, where towers consider themselves subjects of their own kingdom, the Citadel's ravens went about their errands with an enviable lack of romance. The maester with ink-black fingers continued to write. He set down a chapter about the building of tunnels under the Red Keep and the man who had built them with the intensity of a lover digging a grave for his love. He set down a chapter about a woman who advised a king so gently that he did not notice he had been prevented from cruelty until the day his temper found no purchase and he wept, relieved and ashamed. He wrote of Dark Sister and of the blade's hunger. He wrote of a boy who rode the wrong dragon for reasons that would have sounded noble if they had not been so hopeless. He wrote of the way prophecy turns to ice if held too long and how a single warm breath, love perhaps or laughter, can make it usable again. He walked sometimes to keep the body from declaring mutiny. Under the arches of Old Town's bridges, he noted how the tide presented different arguments to the same stone. He wondered which kind of king wore less at the pillar, the one who forced a flood through by sheer will or the one who waited, measuring, until the river desired change. He thought of the queens, women who had learned to pour themselves from shape to shape like water into jars, who had endured the particular humiliation of being right too early and the particular exaltation of being wrong in time to save a city. In a market he bought honey cakes and ate them slowly, listening to gossip plait itself from fresh and stale strands. When the boy selling figs asked if he believed the dragons would come again, he said the only thing he could say and remain honest: they will, but perhaps not in the form we expect. A caravan drifted east along a road engraved into the earth by generations of stubborn feet. The sky above was white with heat, as if someone had sanded the blue off. A woman with a basket of bulbs that she swore would bloom even in winter named each tired donkey after a dragon because it amused her to bestow on them more history than their spines could carry. "Valyrian," she said, patting a long ear, "you're dribbling." "Vagger," she told a creature who needed very little excuse to halt. "Your glory will be in arriving at all." Travelers laughed or pretended not to, and bartered onions for stories. At night, in a crease of dune the wind lost interest. She held her palms to the fire and asked it for the courtesy of not getting any ideas. It obliged. Years gathered like dust under chairs no one bothers to move. The work went on. In a fishing village in the Stormlands, a man carved a toy dragon for a child from driftwood that had the grace of having been shaped by forces that do not ask permission. He sanded it until it sat well in the child's palm, then gave it eyes with a pin and a glint with a nail. The child flew it over puddles and roofs and the heads of friends. At night, the toy slept beside a crust of bread and a seashell. Some mornings the child woke to find it damp, as if it had flown out, consulted the sea, and returned discreetly before dawn. The father did not mind this fancy. He had learned that to defeat certain kinds of fear you must allow certain kinds of wonder. In the mountains of the moon, an old woman ground herbs with a pestle blackened by decades of the same faithful work. She hummed a kettle song about a queen whose face was the afternoon of a winter's day, fine and hard and unexpectedly bright. She came, the old woman sang softly, not to scold the mountain but to ask it to remember who it was. The patient granddaughter kept rhythm by tapping a spoon against the lip of a jar. "Did the mountain answer?" she asked, more interested in the song's grammar than its subject. "It answered in its way," said the old woman. "It held. On the long shore of the shivering sea, where the surf sounds like paper being crumpled forever, a fisherman lying on his back beside an overturned skiff watched the slow migration of cloud and tried to see the shape of a dragon in their passing. He could not. He saw instead the blunt, honest shapes of fish, the knuckled grit of a northerly squall, a woman's shoulder he had not the courage to ask to stay. He fell asleep and dreamed of smoke coiling from a cliff, and when he woke he had the taste of ash and of apples in his mouth at the same time. He took this to mean he should go inland and sell his catch. He did and met, in a market square, a man who would later save his life by warning him of a crack in the ice. This, he felt, could also be counted as a dragon's doing, indirectly and with more mercy than expected. The story, grown heavy with its own length, began to thin, as stories must if they are to move. Images that had crowded the first telling found their places and stayed there. Others, once indispensable, learned to make themselves scarce. Men who had attached their self-respect to the argument that no good could come from wings found themselves mellowing, unable to keep scorn hot beyond the period of their own youth. Women who had built altars to the flames that had lit their ambition learned to love the steadier light of hearth and lamp. Children who had slept to the lullaby of fire learned newer lullabies about sailors and bakeries and the stubborn bravery of sheep. When, after a bitter winter and a lazy spring, a comet unrolled across the night like a careless scarf, people found the old talk crowded in again. They set out bowls of water to catch whatever influence fell. Lovers made vows and then noticed, sheepish and pleased, that they would have made them anyway. A new prince was born somewhere men cared about princes, and the midwives exchanged that old, idiotic, invincible grin. A little boy who was not any kind of prince at all was born in a hut that had just stopped leaking. And as his mother held him, the light from the comet poured across the thatch and made it seem as if they lived inside a great lucid berry. "Ah," said the grandmother, and no one asked her what she meant, because everyone understood exactly. There were scholars who grew angry at the refusal of dragons to stay in their pages and be counted like sheep. There were soldiers who grew quiet when the subject rose, and turned their cups in their hands as if they hoped to see the shape of a wing in the wine. There were merchants who wished the dear days would come again, when men paid for hope with gold instead of with effort. There were priests who found, as priests always do, that fear attends worship more faithfully than joy, and that one must sternly show it the door every morning. There were fools who painted their bodies with scales and stood in markets breathing smoke, and anyone with a child on their hip gave them coin because fools also pay for bread. On a clear evening in a meadow whose grasses told soft stories about deer, a troupe of actors set up a show. They had, as all actors do, managed to mislay half of what they needed and discovered, as all actors do, that this made no difference. They made a dragon from hoops and silk and for sturdy young men. And when the drum sounded, the silk rippled and the world grew. For a blink, for sizes larger. They told the rise with laughter and the fall with a kind of contrition. When the dragon leaned down to stare with painted eyes at a little girl in the front row, she lifted her hand to its jaw as if to show that she understood how to be gentle with a living thing. The audience forgot, for the span of a lantern's oil, that the story was old and that their feet hurt and that someone would have to wash all the cups. They remembered only that the air has room for a beast larger than law. Somewhere in the tall chambers of a library where dust motes hold tiny parliaments at noon, a book bound in sober calf was lifted from its shelf by a hand that did not tremble. The maester who had written it was dead now, his chain buried with him, and another had added a preface with the tentative pride of a man entering a house he did not build. The book opened on the page where the dragons came west over a water white with wind, then turned to the day a boy tried to be braver than he was and failed and lived anyway, then turned again to a woman standing alone in a room that had too much history in it and saying her own name aloud until it so. Dead less like a stranger to her. A lamp burned without smoking. Outside, a bell announced an hour no one disputed. On a cliff above a sea that was practicing for winter, two sisters wrapped in the same cloak stood hip to hip and watched the last light leave the waves the way the last warmth leaves a hand. The older said she had once seen a dragon's shadow move through clouds like a fish through water. The younger said nothing, perhaps because she had no such memory, perhaps because words sometimes ruin the rich quiet between people who know how to share it. At their feet, in a crack between stones, a small plant the wind had brought and the rain had admitted grew one shiny, unreasonable leaf. The older noticed it and did not tell the younger. She had learned the pleasure of letting the world do its own announcing. Night widened, as it always does when invited, and the first stars arrived like old friends not seen in years, each politely not remarking on the changes time had made in the others. A wind got up from the west and went east, undecided, then came back as if having remembered an errand forgotten more than once. In a house not far away, a mother told a child the story of rise and fall with all the gentleness she possessed. She slowed the harshness and gave breath to the kindness. She turned down the flame. The child's eyes, which had been so bright and eager at the mention of wings, dimmed not from boredom but from the mercy of sleep. The mother kept speaking because the words were good company, and sometimes words work even without ears to receive them. She spoke of a family who had become a word and a word that had become a warning and a warning that had become a lullaby. Then she kissed the child's brow, blew away a stray hair, set her palm on the rise and fall of a ribcage, and listened to the old steady kingdom of breath. The wind crossed the water to Dragonstone and, for no reason at all that wind ever gives, went down into the caverns and touched the walls, which did not answer but were not unpleased. It ran over the spot where the dragon keepers had once put out bowls of meat and bowls of water and bowls of hot stones so their beasts might choose their own comfort. It made a soft, ribbon-like sound near a place where shells had been swallowed into stone. Then it went on, as all travelers must. Above, the sea pulled at the shore with a lover's mixed patience and hunger. The moon rose. The world, which contains both flame and the hands that try to hold it, settled its shoulders and prepared, without hurry, to dream again. And in that dream, as in all the better ones, there were wings. Not because wings flatter the heart with their height, but because they remind it that height is meaningless without the willingness to come down again. There were kings and queens, as there always will be in the minds of those who go to sleep near warmth. Not because kings and queens solve anything, but because they stand in for the part of us that longs to answer when anyone asks what we are for. There were fields plowed and left to rest. There were ships fitted and set to run before a wind that had been taught not to break masts unless breaking was a lesson needed. There were rivers minding their own business and men suddenly wise enough to let them. The rise and the fall went on being told in kitchens and camps and courts, and with each telling the burden shifted a little from the shoulders of those who had carried it. It is a good fate for a story to survive its heroes. It means they have done enough that the rest can be entrusted to people whose names will never be written down except in a family Bible or a lawsuit or a love letter. A potter's apprentice shaping a jug noticed that his hands, though made of his father's hands, did not tremble when the kiln roared. A horse with the temperament of a mare carried a child standing on its back beneath a sky clean as laundry and did not shy when a hawk flew low. A woman at last learned to sleep without waking at some remembered shout. She woke to the sound of rain and lay there smiling until the light made her get up. So it might have ended there on that domestic chord, with dragons at last just the shape the mind gives to yearning and to terror. But the world, conservative as it is, prefers echoes. Along a coast where wind and grammar share a strictness, a boy with the pale hair people notice and then politely forget, being kind or superstitious by turns, sat on a wall and threw crumbs to gulls. He had heard the whole story many times, sometimes told as a caution and sometimes told as a promise, and had already decided, as boys do, which parts were boring and which parts he wanted to be true. He closed his eyes and listened. For a moment, it seemed to him that he could hear something vast turn over in sleep far below the surface of things, the earth adjusting its shoulder to a dream, or a name getting ready to be spoken again after years of silence. The sound frightened him and fascinated him and was gone as soon as he tried to grasp it. He went home, where his mother was rubbing oil into a table with a cloth that had once been a dress. She asked him because mothers cannot resist what he had seen. He said, thinking of how complicated truth becomes once it leaves the mouth, "Birds." She smiled. Later she told him the story again while they waited for bread, and this time she emphasized, for reasons of her own she could not have explained, the parts where kindness had been tried and found not only possible but effective. The boy listened to the cadence, that old soothing river, and felt his own heart make the easy agreement we call hope. Far away, in a room with a single window looking onto an alley where the light never fully arrived, a man polished a horn that could wake something if blown in the right place at the right time by the right person for the right reason. He knew all this and had known it for years and had not once lifted it to his lips. The horn held, in its patient, spiraled body, all the what-ifs a man can accumulate without going mad. He set it down and, against every habit of his life, opened the window and let in the sound of rain. After a long while, he slept without dreams and woke kinder than he had been. There will be no grand ending, not now. It is not the way of the world to gather itself into a final image that lets us close the book with the clean satisfaction of absolutes. Instead, there is the endless business of living. The small cold of bare feet on morning floors, the way a neighbor's cough becomes one's own worry, the joy of an egg uncracked in the pan, the grief that arrives decently dressed and then refuses to leave. Through all of it runs the story like a warm pipe behind a wall, unseen but making the room habitable. We go to sleep to it, the way sailors sleep to the knock and sigh of water against hulls, and we wake to it as to a good fire already laid. Some night, tonight perhaps, or some night when the smoke lies like ribbon in the house and the shutter, for once, does not bang. The old tale will be told again, and again the dragons will rise, and again they will fall, and again the meaning will be not in the rising and not in the falling but in the hand that stirs the embers at the end and says, "Enough for now," and gives to each listener the slow permission to dream. And if, among those dreams, something stirs that is large and eloquent and eager for sky, perhaps it will remember what the story learned over all these years, that flight is only ever worth the bruises of landing if a home waits below, with bread and with mercy and with a chair pulled close to the quiet, inexhaustible fire.